you can't keep a 12-inch tarantula in a 10-gallon tank. It's just not feasible. It's not fair. It's not right. So people are realizing that as your tarantula grows, you do need to rehouse it into something more appropriate.
You're listening to Jeremy from Primal Fear Tarantula, which is a premium acrylic tarantula enclosure company straight out of Manitoba, Canada, which happens to be my home province. So it was an absolute pleasure to speak with Jeremy today.
When I'm pricing things, there's two things I keep in mind. One, how much does it cost to have the same thing in glass? And what are our friends down south paying?
You are listening to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Jeremy and I discuss in this episode how he started Primal Fear Tarantulas. This is actually one of those positive COVID stories. Really, if you rewind the clock 3 years ago, Primal Fear Tarantulas did not exist. Jeremy found a hole in the market and decided to serve his community in the best way possible, which was create a product that isn't available. Now, for those who are American, you might not realize that things in Canada are much tougher to get. It's not quite as simple as many of you experience, and the fact that Jeremy decided to take the plunge and do an entire business to rectify a problem in our community is incredible. If you are an American tarantula keeper, then this is an episode that you're going to want to listen to because it will save you money. If you're a Canadian tarantula keeper, then this is also an episode you'll want to listen to because Jeremy is providing us with a product at a very good price for something that we've not previously had in our market, which is incredible.
Because when they go on, they're paying, the same price as they would there, but in Canadian dollars. So right away, there's about a 25% discount for those guys right off the hop.
We also discuss how to properly set up tarantula enclosures.
1 part organic topsoil, 1 part cocoa coir, and 1 part peat moss.
And we close out the episode discussing the current phenomenon of jumping spiders, how they have become so popular, and how to care for them.
2 main species in the hobby right now are the Audex, which are the bold jumpers, and the Gallus, which are the regal jumpers. They seem to be the most common. But
here is my conversation with Jeremy from Primal Fear Tarantulas. Well, Jeremy, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Looking forward to chatting with you. Obviously, we met in person a couple months ago. You set me up with some tarantula enclosures as well. You live in Manitoba, which is, I think, there's a very small community. So that's where I wanted to start. Quite often I try to get the background on people, how they got into what they're doing. But I find it particularly interesting being a Manitoban as well, because we do have quite a small community. Most of the listeners are American. And even if you live in a small reptile community in the States, it's still huge compared to what we have here, or reptile and exotic community. So I'm curious, how did you fall into this world?
Well, I started at a young age in the exotic pet community. I've kind of lived all over Canada. I was born on the East Coast, raised on the West Coast, kind of bounced back and forth between the two. Kind of a city boy on the West Coast and not so much on the East Coast. And ended up in Manitoba. So I've always had exotics my whole life. And I guess what really the catalyst for where I am right now is right before COVID, I had to put my dog down. While my kids were being raised, I didn't really have a lot of exotics. But once I had to put my dog down, I wasn't really into getting another dog. So was doing some research online and decided to get something that I've wanted for a long time, which was a chameleon. And that was kind of the catalyst of where I am now. So that was around the start of COVID. Got myself a chameleon and ended up finding that there was a tarantula breeder importer just outside of Winnipeg. And got my first tarantula when I was about 15 or 16. So we're talking 1989, 1990, somewhere in there. Was really always intrigued by tarantulas. Just the way they move, the way they attack prey. It was back then when I was 15 or 16, it was pretty cool to have a pet that most people found repulsive. I kind of found that pretty neat, little bit of danger. So I kept tarantulas, in my high school years, then moved out to the West Coast from the East Coast. And I was doing my plumbing apprenticeship in Victoria, and I was doing some work on a pet store there. And ended up getting paid in exotic pets. So at that time, I was about 20 years old, and I had an office full of exotics. I had geckos and bearded dragons, and I've always been into fish as well. So I had piranhas and kind of whatever bunch of emperor scorpions, just a whole office full of exotic pets. And kept those, I was kind of in the hobby then through my 20s, and then started having kids. So I kind of was low key on exotics while I raised my kids. And then, like I say, had to put my dog down during COVID, got back into tarantulas, hooked up with Mel from Webs and Scales just outside of Winnipeg there. And then went in full force. COVID had lots of downtime. So research and collecting. And that's kind of what got me back into the hobby.
That's what I find fascinating, because we're going to get into your business and everything in a minute. And it's amazing how obviously you have this, a deep background of keeping exotics, and you have this, passion for it. But it's amazing looking at the business that you have and what's behind you, that this just started during COVID. I mean, without COVID, I'm sure none of this you wouldn't have gone down this path, maybe.
Probably not. Like I say, well, I own a plumbing and heating company, and when COVID hit, everything just died. Nobody wanted me in their house at all. So it was, and new construction kind of died. Everything, I mean, like everything else, it just dropped off. So I had lots of time on my hands, a reignited passion for the hobby, and I just seen a need for for enclosures in the community.
Yeah. Was there something about, and obviously, sorry to bring up a sore subject, but putting your dog down, was there something about that reminded you of the exotic side, or like what about that experience sent you back down this path?
I wasn't ready for another dog, for one, and just kind of reflecting on an old passion. Like I say, when my kids were younger, one, I didn't have a whole lot of time for exotic pets because, let's face it, you have a collection of exotics, it takes time. It's quite a commitment, right? So I kind of focused on raising my kids, and dog's a good family pet, and all that. My kids are, like I say, are moving out and moving on with life, so I don't have that time commitment anymore. And I guess it was just a combination of having lots of time on my hands and doing some reading and just reignited that passion.
Mm-hmm. And so you said you contacted Mel from Webs and Scales, and that's where I picked up my first two tarantulas as well. How did it go from just getting a couple to starting the business? That's you hear the story of people collection growing, but obviously getting a business from scratch is another level to that.
Well, I'm pretty OCD when it comes to the look and display of my collection. And to be honest, when I was collecting, I started with dollar store containers that I drilled out, which work fine and they look great. They serve a function, they're perfect. But I searched and searched online. I searched Amazon and just did a whole bunch of searching for, nice display cases to display my tarantulas. And there really was absolutely nothing in Canada. There's a couple of companies in the States that make some pretty nice enclosures. I ordered a couple of those to start, but by the time we pay the exchange rate from Canadian to US, then duty and shipping, there's no way I'm going to house 50 tarantulas at that kind of cost. So I started exploring other ideas, and I talked to Mel, and even to find like AMEC boxes in Canada. And I mean, I'm not in the biggest city either, too. Brandon's pretty small. Manitoba is small to begin with, but Brandon is pretty limited on what we got here. So even just to find AMEC boxes was almost impossible. So then I started making my own, and talked to Mel, and she was interested in maybe, providing her customers with some nice enclosures, and that kind of just went from there.
It's a very similar experience I had when you first enter the Tarantula Hobby, because part of the Tarantula Hobby that's exciting is how easy it is to pick up enclosures and find things. But when you start going through the list of people saying, these are the items on Amazon that you can easily convert to a tarantula enclosure. In Canada, none of those things show up on Amazon.ca. It's all .com. No. And then, like you said, as soon as you cross the border and they nail you with taxes and you pay shipping, you are easily paying double from what the ticket price of
Absolutely.
whatever it is you're ordering. So you kind of have, like you said, you can't do that for everything. A one-off experience is fine. I bought some artwork like last year. I had to pay duty on it, but I'm not going to be doing that for 50 tarantulas, for example. So you kind
Absolutely.
of have, it has to make sense. And so how many tarantulas do you have now?
Right. According to my wife, way too many.
Yeah, me too.
I've
And I only have
probably,
two.
including slings, I've probably got somewhere between 60 to 70 tarantulas.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty sizable collection to manage.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, like I say, it's a quite the work to maintain for sure.
Well, and even as you said at the beginning, you started doing DIY things and creating your own. There's kind of a limit to that as well, depending on how many you have. You can't. So were you just sourcing sheets of acrylic, or what were you doing for the DIY side before you started the business?
Like I say, I started just buying pre-made containers, from either Canadian Tire or from the dollar store and drilling them myself. Um, the downfall of that is sometimes they're not very functional. For a terrestrial tarantula, anything that opens from the top is fine. When you start getting into the fossorial and the arboreal tarantulas, there's really no pre-made container that you can do it yourself make functional enough to house that tarantula. So that's kind of really the change over there, is just having something functional for other species other than just your common curly hair or red-knee tarantula.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into kind of how you started the business, but one thing I'll say too is being a fresh tarantula keeper, it the first thing I started keeping in was those the olive containers that you get from superstores. So the
Yeah.
classic like 16-ounce deli cup, and yeah, 16 ounce. And there's an appeal to that because it's essentially free. I always eat olives anyway, so you clean them out and then you have these enclosures. But as a new keeper, there were so many things that I hated about them. And I know there's lots of tarantula keepers that would say, "Why would you spend money on an enclosure when you can just go and get these things for free?" But as a new person, it's hard to see the animal
Yeah.
through because it's a cloudy plastic, and B, like I was still afraid of them. I'm still tentative and scared of them, and I don't want to be walking my hands around this lid slowly, like scaring the spider, because the lids don't come off very easy. So
Yeah.
between those
By the
two
time you get
things,
it open, it's already on edge.
exactly, it's on edge. You're
Yeah.
on edge because you've been trying to like get this thing open. It clicks itself back in by the time you get all the way around the circle, and it's just such a pain. And I hated it, and I thought maybe at some point when if you have a whole bunch and it makes sense, but to start, I was just so much happier to have the enclosures that you had sent me. So tell me about so you decided that you found the hole in Canada. There was no place really producing these types of enclosures. What's next? Where do you go from there?
So I guess the first thing I did was kind of took a look at everything on the market all over. Anything I could find, I kind of took a look at and see what's available. Sized up the enclosures I purchased from the States, kind of seen what I liked about them and what I didn't like about them. And then I started really basic. I had a 3x3x6 box, essentially, with a top sliding lid. And I had a couple of those made. I went on Facebook, onto the various tarantula and invertebrate groups I'm in, and kind of just got some feedback from the Canadian groups, got some feedback from my fellow Canadians, and kind of went from there, seeing what their input was, kind of gauged interest. And I found that there were lots of Canadians in the same position as me, searching for a decently priced quality enclosure to showcase their tarantulas. So kind of took the feedback, and I just thought about that for a while. I just kind of left it at that, and then started drawing up some designs. I talked to a couple of friends here who actually have sign businesses, and they were at the time doing acrylic and plexiglass enclosures for COVID. So they already had their CNC machines working on on plexiglass barriers and acrylic barriers, and all those sneeze shields you see at the restaurants and stuff. So they were already working with acrylics, and talked to a couple of those guys about getting some acrylics cut, and and started playing with designs.
And did you just start assembling it yourself and just, doing your
I
best to,
started like that.
yeah.
Acrylic's not the easiest to work with. And then, after I got my prototypes kind of made up and figured out designs I liked, I started, there was no, the amount of time it takes to cleanly build an acrylic enclosure is insane.
Hmm.
One slip with glue and it's a mess. So then I started seeking out bio, and again, I wanted to keep costs down for Canadians. That was the whole key purpose in doing this, was to make them affordable and realistic. So then I started seeking out production and ended up talking to my wife, and I've had various businesses over the years, so I already had some kind of connections overseas, and and I started talking to a factory overseas and nailed down a design team after many many months of talking with people and having prototypes sent to me and working through that. I nailed down a design team in a factory overseas that I now utilize full time. There's no way I could keep up with the demand.
Wow. So was it difficult to establish that relationship as far as, this is what we want, or are they pretty much turnkey?
Absolutely difficult. I've probably, like realistically, I've been at this now. Well, my first expo with one or two enclosures was the fall expo in Winnipeg last year. So not quite a year. I've had Primal Fear Tarantulas,
Wow.
and in the first 6 months, I got prototypes from probably five factories. And that's not even a fast process. Like, by the time you get it made and then shipped over, it's sometimes a month and a half to get. So, you know, cost and quality, they're the two main things that I was concerned with. And it did take a lot of time and a lot of conversations, sometimes not so easy conversations to nail down the perfect combination. But I think the guys I'm working with now, they're pretty darn good. We've got a pretty good product out there right now.
So how does the production work now? If somebody orders, like, do you keep stock where you are, or are
I do,
things? Oh,
yeah.
you do. Okay.
And I've only been going a year, so it is a growing business. So there are times when I'm out of stock of something or low stock here, especially in expo season, because I'm trying to balance my online sales and my in-person sales at expos and stuff. So it is a bit of a struggle, financially, to try and keep a huge inventory, but everything's just going back into the business right now, so it is getting better.
Hmm. And you did quite a circuit of expos this year so far. I think you've done what, three or four?
Yeah, yeah. So far, I try and do the Calgary Expo in the spring and the fall. Um, this spring was my second Calgary Expo. It's always a good time there. Lots of good people in the community. It's a
Hmm.
decent market. Um, I tried an expo in Saskatoon this year, which was okay. It's a lot like Manitoba. And it was post-COVID too. So I guess it was their first expo in a while. So they were still ironing out some kinks and stuff. And then I always hit the Winnipeg Expo.
Hmm.
That's my home base. So I like to support that community as good as possible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's nice. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of rebuilding happening in the prairies as far as after COVID. So these things
Absolutely.
will build back up, and the communities are already kind of small. Are you? Do you have plans to go to Toronto in the fall, or I
I
think you
am.
did?
I'm super excited. I've got a really good customer base on the West Coast. Due to the Calgary Expo, lots of people come from BC. It's a pretty big expo for the West, but I'm super excited to hit the Canadian Reptile Breeders Expo in Toronto here next month. I can't wait for that.
Yeah, that'll be a good time. I will be there as well, so I'll come visit
Yeah,
the booth. and
awesome.
and I must have just popped into the tarantula hobby at the perfect time because by the time I started getting interested in tarantulas, you already existed and your website was there and everything. So I just assumed that you had been around for a while. I'm like, oh, this is like, what are the chances there's somebody in Manitoba? But it turns out that you just created it not that long ago. So it's pretty amazing how you've gone from getting back in to being essentially one of the only tarantula enclosure providers in Canada in a matter of just a couple of years.
Well, I mean, the beautiful thing about Canada is the support network. I mean, especially when I know myself, when somebody fulfills a need in the Canadian market, you're like, yes, finally,
Yes.
because we are a bit of underdogs when it comes to specialized goods. You're always looking outside Canada. Especially down to the States. I mean, the market there is so huge. It's easy for a business to start and take off and do really well. In Canada, not so much. We're a spread out country. So, I mean, before social media, this would have been impossible because you'd
Yeah.
never be able to advertise yourself to a big enough community to support the business. It just wouldn't happen.
You'd have to spend
So,
thousands and thousands of dollars just in the hope you hit one
absolutely.
tarantula guy.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be taking ads out in magazines all over the country just to get your name out there. But I mean, with Facebook and Instagram, it's unbelievable. And then word of mouth. Um, I'm very active in the hobby. I'm active in the groups on social media. I'm always happy to share my knowledge or to take in knowledge. It's very interactive. So um, word of mouth spreads fast, and I always take the feedback into consideration and just try and be there for the community. Before a business, I was a hobbyist, and I'll always be a hobbyist. I have a huge passion for tarantulas in particular, but exotics in general. And when you're passionate about something, you like to share it, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, for those who are listening who maybe not familiar with your product line, do you want to just walk through just a couple of the products or a few of the items that you have and how what the enclosures look like, just to build people a little bit of a picture?
Sure. So like I say, the first thing I started with was just a 3 by 3 by 6 box. Um, and basically now that's my kind of fossorial sling enclosure. From there, I did the 8-inch cube, and all this originated with other people's feedback. So um, the first thing people asked for was a bigger enclosure. So then I went 8 by 8 by 8 cube. And I took that 8 by 8 by 8 cube and the 3 by 3 by 6 enclosure to that first expo in Winnipeg there, set up on a little corner. Mel from Webs and Scales was nice enough to give me a little corner of her table. And I set up those two enclosures and kind of just showed them off and got people's feedback.
Mm.
And right away, people wanted something for arboreals, which, you know, myself personally, I like arboreals. They're a little bit more of a showcase. As soon as you get into terrestrials and fossorials, you're looking at a burrow, right? So
Right.
arboreals are a little bit more entertaining to look at, a little better to show off. So um, actually, the first enclosure I picked up from the States was an arboreal enclosure. So I kind of looked at that. It had a front opening door, which was great, easy access. Um, but I thought I could improve on that a little bit, and I made it with a top and a front opening door. So to this day, that's probably one of my biggest sellers is the 3 by 3 by 6 arboreal enclosure with the front and top opening. You might not always use that top opening, but when you do need it, like during a rehouse or even just setting up the enclosure, it makes it super handy.
Yeah, yeah.
So I made that one. Then then basically worked on sizes. Everybody wanted bigger, bigger. Going from a sling into a juvenile into an adult. So it's been a slow process. Like I say, I'm not a rich man, so to build up a line of enclosures takes some time. But now we've got that same enclosure in a 6 by 6 by 8, and 8 by 8 by 12. So basically, for most stages of a tarantula, I've got the 8-inch cube enclosure. We've got now a 12-inch cube, then a 12 by 8 by 8 enclosure for terrestrial, and then the newest one I made was kind of a novelty enclosure in the shape of a casket.
Mm.
Um, I made at one of the expos. I also do some 3D printing for decor, and I do some backgrounds for the enclosures, and that's been really popular. But people really like these casket water dishes that I was making,
Okay. Yeah,
and
yeah.
they just flew off the shelf. And I thought, okay, maybe there's something there. So I made these little sling enclosures in the shape of a casket. They can be used for terrestrial or fossorial, and they've been a big hit. So that was kind of my latest design. And there's a couple others I'm working on right now, but we'll see what comes down the pike here.
So, does it seem like the tarantula community in general is gravitating towards keeping their adults in larger enclosures than would have been the norm maybe a decade ago? Because that's sort of, I don't know if that's what's happening, or just, you got lots of requests for people going bigger.
I think there's more education. Back when I started, there was no internet. You had encyclopedias and the guy at the pet store.
Right.
For example, when I got my first tarantula, I was told 10-gallon tank for life, some sand, and a water dish with a sponge, and you're good to go.
Yeah, the
But
classic.
there's a lot more education now, and people realize, you can't keep a 12-inch tarantula in a 10-gallon tank. It's just not feasible. It's not fair. It's not right. So people are realizing that as your tarantula grows, you do need to rehouse it into something more appropriate. And you don't want to start it in something too big because you're never going to find it. It's never going to find its food. So there is a general process of progression in enclosure. So um, as the hobby grows, you're getting more people into slings. There's more demand for bigger enclosures. So I think that's where the need for the bigger enclosures came, was just people growing in the hobby
Mhm.
and understanding that you do need to have an appropriate size enclosure as the tarantula grows.
Yeah, that's always the question that people say. It's like, why are they kept in such small enclosures? But until you've kept a small spider, it's so true. I mean, you can't tell if it's eating, and you don't want to lose it. So you need to have some
No,
eyes on it. But once it gets to a mature size, yeah, I think, I don't know how large you could go, but do you foresee going even larger with the product line that you currently have, or is it kind of maxed out with the design?
it's kind of tough. Again, keeping things affordable.
Right.
Acrylic, no matter how good your acrylic is, it has a tendency with moisture and heat to warp a little bit. So as you get, I've got a couple of enclosures here behind me. I've got crested geckos in there. They're, um, 18-inch enclosures. The problem is no matter how careful you are, it tends to have stiff doors, and it just doesn't fit right. So and then there's shipping as well. Like
Right.
the even the 12 by 12 enclosures, every time I send one off, I'm nervous that I'm going to get a call it's broken when it gets here, no matter how well you pack it. So there is a bit of a limit on size for shipping. Um, and at some point, quality does start going down. And that's just not something I'm willing to do. So I try and I think 12 by 12 is probably going to be my standard large enclosure.
Hmm.
Um, if I can source out some reasonable acrylics that are a little less prone to warping, maybe the 18-inch arboreal at one time will become a standard. But again, it's just a matter of demand. I mean, I can have anything made custom. It's just a matter of keeping cost and quality in line.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the original sort of goal with the business, is not to create enclosures that are out of the price range, and that's what's great about them.
No,
They look great, and they're sharp, and they're not expensive, especially coming from the reptile world. An enclosure is quite expensive, and then when you can get into spiders, you're like, oh, I can buy a closure for $40 or $50 or whatever it is. It's kind of nice. It's like you're sort of at ease. Like, okay, that's not too bad.
well, there's two standards when I'm pricing things, there's two things I keep in mind. One, how much does it cost to have the same thing in glass? And what are our friends down south paying? So
Right.
I try and keep my pricing in line with everybody else down south, but in Canadian dollars. So, you're basically getting the same enclosure or something of same quality. And it's fair because you're paying the same as our friends down south, but you're paying in your own currency. So there's quite the savings there. So that's kind of where I keep my pricing, is so that I'm kind of market value, but in our own dollar.
Right.
And that's kind of been my process in pricing things out. And also, I think as the business grows, obviously my production runs can be bigger, and I feel like I could probably get pricing down a little bit more once I get to the point where I can start ordering, large mass quantities of enclosures.
Right. Well, as you were saying that, I'm sure every American tarantula keeper's ears pricked up, because to get a get to match a price in Canadian dollars with US dollars is quite a significant reduction in cost. Do you ship? Do you have American customers as well?
Absolutely. It's I'm just starting, like through Instagram and stuff. I'm just starting to catch on. I've got my website, but I also started an Etsy store, which that's probably 90% American customers.
Okay.
Um, it was really funny when I started on Etsy. I had lots of Canadian customers, but then in order to get advertised in the States, you have to have free shipping. So I upped the price a little bit to counter some of that shipping cost. And right away, Canadian customers fell and American customers went way up. Canadians seem to like a cheaper price with shipping, and Americans seem to like a more hefty price and no shipping.
Right.
So it was kind of a weird change. So through Etsy, I've had lots of American sales in the last 6 months or so. But actually, in the last couple of weeks here, I just partnered with a guy out of California who's going to be an affiliate. He's starting to carry my line. I just sent him off a big box of enclosures, and he's actually doing the Reptile Super Show in Pomona here in California in a couple weeks.
Cool.
So he's going to have his booth set up. He's got quite a big Instagram and TikTok following. It's Frank's Buggin 661. Super nice guy, and he's super excited about having my enclosures, and I'm super excited about him carrying them. So the American market is starting to catch on, which is great. Again, I'm more focused on my Canadian market, but it doesn't hurt to have those sales in America. And like you say, it's a bit of an unfair advantage because exactly what was a detriment to us is a huge bonus for our American friends. Because when they go on, they're paying, the same price as they would there, but in Canadian dollars. So right away, there's about a 25% discount for those guys right off the hop.
I just want to take a short break from today's episode to thank each and every one of you for tuning in today. If you would like to show more support for the podcast, you can do that by checking out the show's sponsor, Custom Reptile Habitats. There is an affiliate link in both the YouTube description and the show notes. If you do make a purchase through that link, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. The other way you can show support to the podcast is through the Patreon account. For as little as 75 cents per episode, you will automatically be added to the Discord server so you can communicate and chat with other like-minded keepers. If you do bump yourself up to the $5 a month tier, you'll have early access to the episodes and the opportunity to submit questions to upcoming guests. Again, I am so grateful for each and every one of you. This podcast is a lot of work and costs me a lot of money each month to run, and any support coming from your end is greatly appreciated. Back to the episode. Yeah, and I feel like they don't have to pay as much in shipping and duty. I don't know how duty work. Do they pay duty? Or if they do, it's nothing like we pay.
No, and shipping, for me to ship to the States is probably about 2/3 the cost. I can ship an enclosure to Florida for about $10, and me to ship that enclosure to, say, New Brunswick is almost 18. So the cost
so annoying.
It is, but I mean, it's relative to the population, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If you got Canada Post delivering 5 parcels, they got to charge more than the US Post shipping 300 parcels, right? So it's frustrating. But like I say, I try and offset that as much as I can for the Canadian hobbyists, just to make it a little more fair.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I order my frozen feeders for my snakes, the cost of shipping exceeds the cost of the rodents, and because
Absolutely.
it's frozen and it's so I forget. I'll order enough rats and quail for almost a year, and yeah, shipping will cost me well over $100. It's just the way it is. But
yeah,
getting into that American market will only help us Canadians because your business will grow and it'll allow us to have more
Absolutely.
options, and I think your business growing is a good thing. So for those Americans out there who are interested in a discount enclosure, you got to check out Primal Fear. That's cool. Let's talk a little bit about setting up tarantula enclosures, because I think that's
Sure.
another, that's you have a business creating enclosures. The next step is actually setting up the enclosure. So maybe you mentioned that arboreal species are some of your favorites. Do you want to just run through how you would set up? Let's take your largest arboreal setup. We can just pick a random species, and then how would you set that enclosure up?
Well, the first thing you want to pick is your substrate. There's lots of companies out there that make tarantula or invertebrate specific substrates. there's a ton of options, do-it-yourself options. I personally use a mix that I do myself. Um, 1 part organic topsoil, 1 part coco coir, and 1 part peat moss. And that's kind of my standard substrate. I use that for a lot of my exotics, whether it's geckos or tarantulas or scorpions or whatever. It holds moisture well, it aerates well, and it's it's just a good substrate. So that's the first thing is
Do you do
picking a
anything
substrate.
to the peat moss or the topsoil beforehand? Is like, do you put it in the oven or anything to kill anything in there, or you have never had any issues? Because I remember
I've
using peat moss once, and all of a sudden I had all these little garden centipedes in my day gecko enclosure. And I'm like, did that come from the peat moss? It might have come from the plants. I don't know. But have you ever
I
had any
guess
issues?
no, I've been pretty fortunate. Like I use the same, I can't remember. It's a Canadian peat moss, a Canadian company. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's been really well, and I've never had an issue with any kind of any
Pests.
kind of no, not at all. So I don't know if I've been lucky or just picked a
For me, it
good,
was probably the plants. I probably had Home Depot plants or something, and they always come with some extra.
could be. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah. So yeah, no, I've been really lucky, and I've been using that now for a couple of years, that same mix, just stick to the same brands. When it comes to the topsoil, you just want to make sure there's nothing added to it, no plant food or anything like that, fertilizers. Basically, the cheapest topsoil you can get is the best because it's unrefined, it's just straight sterilized topsoil.
Hmm.
So the cheaper the bag, probably the better it is for our needs. So that's kind of the substrate I use is a mix of those 3 things. I have used coco coir by itself in the past, but I find once it dries out, it's not the best for burrowing.
Hmm.
It tends to cave in because it does get so dry. So having that peat moss in there and some topsoil, it gives it a little bit more of a compaction, a little better for burrowing. So that's kind of what I use for my substrate. And then it's just a matter of decor. And really anything can be used as decor. Depends on you. That's where your personality shines, and that's
Hmm.
part of the fun of setting up an enclosure. Whether there's kind of 2 camps when it comes to decor. One is the naturalistic environment, which is kind of where I tend to stick to, and then you got what I call like the dollhouse community, who like to have the little dressers and couches
Yeah.
and such, which is cute, just not my style. I like to stick more to the naturalistic and botanical side of things. So, but I mean, no matter what you use, you want to make sure that it's going to be safe for the tarantula. So, any organics, you either bake it in the oven or you can steam it, or in Manitoba, stick it outside in minus 45 for a couple days,
Yeah.
and
January always does the trick.
that'll probably kill off most things. Um, so then, yeah, just decor. With the arboreals, you want to have lots of anchor points because they're going to web up more than the terrestrial tarantulas. So keep that in mind when you're setting up arboreals. Have some sticks up high, and you can hot glue things to the sides of the enclosures, or lots of people are using magnets just to give it those anchor points. Um, with terrestrials, I always set up some kind of a starter burrow, whether it's a 3D printed cave or a piece of cork bark, or just something where 9 times out of 10 you put a terrestrial in a new enclosure and it'll bolt straight for that burrow. So give them somewhere to go and feel safe right away. So
Hmm.
those are kind of the main parts of setting up an enclosure. And then, obviously you just want to make sure you have the appropriate size enclosure.
Right. Is there would an inappropriate sized enclosure be some of the sort of the top common mistakes you see from new keepers, or is there a couple things in that category?
Yeah, the first mistake that I see is impulse buying. And I
Mm.
got to say it right off the hop, that's the number one, is people buying either a species that they're not ready to handle or have no idea what it's about. Um, you see that guy, the crazy thing about tarantulas, some of the most beautiful are some of the most dangerous.
Yes.
So you see somebody who sees P metallica, bright blue tarantula, and it's beautiful and it's an arboreal and it's always out. They're bolty and they got quite a bite. So it might not be the best beginner tarantula. Always, no matter what exotic you're getting, I always recommend do the research. There's no excuse not to. The internet is absolutely abundant with information. There's social media. There's plenty of great YouTube channels that focus on tarantula husbandry and information on tarantulas. So utilize it. Make sure you know what you're getting into. Find a great beginner species and have something set up for it before you purchase your tarantula. So that, to me, that's the number one mistake right there. The other common mistake I see is, and it's not, you can't blame people, but it's the excitement. It's let your tarantula settle in.
Mm-hmm.
You put it in a new enclosure. It's a new environment. One of the best things about a tarantula is watching it eat. So people, stick this tarantula in a new enclosure and they throw cricket in there and they're expecting the thing just to pounce on it right away. But tarantulas, just like any other exotic, they need some time to settle in. They're kind of a skittish pet to begin with and a little bit nervous. So you want to make sure you give them some time to settle in. And yes, enclosure size is definitely another one. Like I said, when I started, it was quite common to keep any tarantula in a 10-gallon tank. And that was it. I look back, I feel so bad knowing what I know now on and how I kept that first tarantula. I guess a good rule of thumb, it's kind of the general rule of thumb of the hobby, is about 3 times its leg span. So if you've got, a 2-inch arboreal tarantula, then keep it in something 6-8 inches tall. So it's got some room to move around, a little bit of room to see what's going on and find its prey and just some freedom. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And obviously that comes hand in hand with knowing your tarantula too, your research. You don't want to, a pinkfoot Goliath is great at a 1/4-inch sling. But realize that at some point that's going to be a 12-inch leg span, which is going to require more than an 8-inch cube enclosure. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And just hearing you talk about it, it's just giving me flashbacks of just getting into the hobby. Obviously, I've only been keeping these guys for maybe a couple of months, and getting back to just the enclosure design, something that I really appreciated was just how the ease of access, especially with the 8-inch cube, just slide the door back the top and I can get in there with tweezers and tongs and whatnot and change waters. It's very easy. And like you said, when you jump into the hobby as a new person, you're super excited, but you're also kind of tentative and a little bit scared. And it's nice to have space to work with, like to be able to feed them without having to like squeeze things in and not be able to see. It's just, that's what I love about the enclosures. It's just easy to work with them, especially as a newbie.
Well, that's kind of the reason why I chose to go with the sliding top as well. A lot of the enclosures in the hobby, the top just lifts right off.
Yeah.
Which is great if you're an experienced keeper and you're comfortable with your tarantula. But when you're a new keeper, sometimes it might be nice just to crack that lid a little bit and still be able to feed and water your tarantula. Like I always recommend a beginner to keep their water dish towards the back of the enclosure. So you can, open that enclosure a 1/4 inch and water your dish and tend to your tarantula without having to have the whole enclosure exposed. And a chance, I've had it where, you have the top off and tarantula decides to bolt, and now you're chasing down a tarantula with a catch cup. So it makes it a little more secure, and it makes a new owner feel a little better about tending to their tarantula.
Yeah, exactly. That was that exact thought was I don't have to open up the door the entire way. And for, my wife, for example, who's still getting used to these things, it's nice to be able to show her, look, it clips shut. There's magnets that hold it. It can't open the door. There's all these safety precautions. Do you have a favorite species that you work with?
I think my favorite is, and probably because it was my first tarantula, is the curly hair. I mean, they're beautiful, docile tarantulas. Maybe not as exciting or colorful as some other ones, but for me, I guess it's a bit of nostalgia. And then I'm pretty fond of the Balfouris, the M. Balfouris. I've got a communal of 7, and just watching them interact with each other and feeding together has been absolute pleasure. It's so cool to watch a community of tarantulas working together. So right now they're probably pretty close to the top of the list.
What do you keep them in, the communal?
They are in, so I started them off in an 8-inch cube. And you don't want something too big, especially starting off, because then they'll develop their own kind of territories. You want them kind of on top of each other. So now they're actually in this enclosure here, which is like a 12 by 12 by, I think 12 by 12 by 18,
Okay.
18 inches long. And they've been in there actually on my YouTube channel. There's a rehouse video where I set this enclosure up, and they've been in there probably about 5 or 6 months now. And since I put them in there, they've just blown up. I've got Belfories who are single in an enclosure, and for some reason, when they're communal, they seem to grow twice as fast. I don't know what it is, or I don't know the science behind it, but boy, they're just blooming, and they're doing really well in there. It's pretty cool to see how they web up an enclosure and they create little tunnels, and it's pretty fun to watch those guys.
Yeah, well, that size thing is really fascinating. Who the hell knows what that would be? But that's pretty interesting, and that's what I think is amazing about keeping tarantulas. And I said this when I recorded that podcast with Tom Moran, is that a lot of the time they manipulate their environment in such an aggressive way, something so much more than a reptile would. You know, reptiles will use the environment, and if you give them the appropriate environment, they'll use it, whether it's climbing trees or they will even burrow to an extent. But nothing like a tarantula will completely readjust the entire place
Absolutely.
to suit them. It's just such a cool thing to see.
They are absolute full-on redesign masters. There's
Yeah,
nothing cooler than sitting there and watching a tarantula move dirt for an hour. Some people might find it boring. I find it fascinating,
yeah,
just to watch them excavate and move. And it's no matter how you set it up, they're going to rearrange it the way they want. I've
yeah.
got enclosures that I set up 6, 8 months ago, and it looks nothing like the enclosure that I set up. You can decorate it with whatever you want, but chances are it's going to change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking of you having to rehouse the M Belforet again sounds like a nightmare. Like, how do you go about
I
doing
was
something like that?
I was nervous for sure, but it actually wasn't that bad. You know, and that's part of the reason why I made the videos, just to show people, yeah, it can be. I was nervous. I looked nervous on camera, but it went fairly smooth. You just take your time. It's a time thing. Take your time and kind of think about every move before you make it. Have a bunch of catch cups around just in case somebody bolts. But it actually wasn't that bad. It went fairly smooth. There may be a time when I have to rehouse them again. Now they're a little bigger, a little more aggressive. I'll be nervous again. I'm not going to lie,
Yeah,
but I'll get through it and it won't be horrible.
yeah, yeah. And getting back to the people jumping into the hobby too fast, I think in some ways the tarantula hobby does it to themselves as well because of how easy and accessible so many things are. I mean, like the example of freebies is such a crazy
Yeah.
concept, which is awesome. I mean, I totally understand why there is freebies. People have a crazy amount of babies and they got to move them on, right? You don't want to like flush them or anything, but it as a new person, you start like adding stuff to your cart. Like I had the crazy cart, like full with a bunch of different things before I even had my first one. I'm like, okay, let's slow down and let's take a bunch of
Yeah.
these out and let's start with two. But it's so easy to just pick, even more
Well,
than
especially
reptiles.
because the cost, you pick up an exotic reptile, you could be looking at hundreds of dollars.
Yeah,
To pick up an exotic tarantula at a quarter inch, you might be 30, $40. So when it comes to exotic pets, or even, you can pick up a small curly hair, quarter inch curly hair for $10.
yeah,
And, there's several tarantulas in the hobby that are like that. So I see time and time again, new people come into the hobby. And I mean, yeah, I've collected a lot of tarantulas in the last 2 years, but I've also been collecting for 30 plus years. You get somebody who sees a tarantula and it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. And then a month later, they've got 30 tarantulas.
yeah,
And yeah, at a quarter inch, they're a lot of work, but they're a lot more work when they're at 2, 3, 4, 10 inches. So it's slow like a turtle. They're always going to be out there. You don't have to buy 30 tarantulas in your first month. I know it, and it's tough. It's all exotics. It's kind of addictive. It can be an addiction. Just collecting any
yeah.
collection, whether it's toys or whatever. It you see, you want, they're cool. Oh yeah, it's cheap, I buy. But you gotta realize that at some point, these tarantulas are going to grow up. They've got constant needs, and it's a lot of work. You see lots of people who are in the hobby for 6 months, and all of a sudden they're selling a collection of 30, 40 tarantulas, right?
Yeah.
So it's definitely like any exotic, and I think you've touched on it in other podcasts in the past. It's you got to know your limit, and there's no rush, right? Get comfortable with what you got, and then you can always add to that collection later.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, speaking of things that you want, are there any species that you don't have right now that you have your eye on at some point in the future that you think would be a fascinating thing to add, or are you pretty content with what you
Um,
have?
I'm pretty content right now. I had like I say, my son just grew up and moved out, so we just sold our house and kind of downsized a little bit. Um, and it's not my only business. So again, I got to know my limit. I don't want to have more than I can take care of. Right now, a couple evenings a week are solely dedicated to take care of the exotic pets I got, and I'm pretty content right now. I recently had a T. Saldonia, Brazilian jewel that passed away. I would love to replace that at one point in time here when the time's right. But other than that, I'm pretty content with what I got right now.
That's good. And one of the things that I would definitely want to talk to you about, when I met you in person in Winnipeg at the expo, you were telling me that you had jumping spiders for sale that were just sort of flying off the shelves, and I feel like they are people's gateway into tarantulas. And I want to say
Absolutely.
they're relatively new as far as, I mean, I shouldn't say new, but it seems to me in the last 2 years the popularity of jumping spiders has exploded. Maybe it's just because I've just jumped into the arachnid world, but what's your view on that?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that's helped me grow so much. I'd say probably 60%, maybe 70% of the arboreal sling enclosures I sell are for jumping spiders.
Wow.
I haven't seen anything in the hobby grow that fast in a long time. Um, Due in part to social media. I mean, they're TikTok superstars right now. Everybody who's got and they're pretty damn cute, And as far as spiders go, they've got a decent personality. They almost seem to interact with people. A couple kids shows, a couple commercials on TV has kind of endeared them to people. So I haven't seen an animal in the hobby grow and spread that fast in a long time.
And do you breed them? I think you sell them, but do you breed them or do you just acquire them and
No,
resell
right
them?
now I source them from a couple. There's a couple of really good breeders across Canada that I source them from. Um, I've wanted, last year at the expos, I don't ship a lot of spiders. I prefer just to sell them in person. And I like to sell them set up in enclosures so people have them set up properly and I know they're good. Everybody gets sent home with a care sheet, but um, so no, I don't breed them. I source them out from other Canadians. I was going to breed them last year, but I ended up selling all my jumping spiders. Uh, I had a couple for show at the last Winnipeg fall show last year. I had a half a dozen jumping spiders that I was just kind of showing off my enclosures, and I got hounded enough to sell them, which I totally regretted because my plan was to breed them over the winter. Now I do have a personal collection that I will hold on to, and I'll try my hand at breeding this year.
There's more than one species of jumping spider.
Absolutely. So the two main species in the hobby right now are the Audex, which are the bold jumpers, and the Gallus, which are the regal jumpers. They seem to be the most common, but I mean, there's over 5,000 types of jumping spider species, I believe, somewhere in the number of 5 to 6,000. So there's
Oh
tons
my
out there.
God.
Um, in Canada, we don't have, those kind of numbers. And to be honest with you, I'm not super familiar with what else is out there. I know there's like a mustache jumper and there's white jumpers. I think down south there tends to be a lot more local species than we have here.
Mhm.
But the popularity in Canada, at least, is the regals and the bold jumpers for sure.
And they actually get, because when I picture a jumping spider, I picture something really small. Although I notice that the ones in the hobby are fairly big. Like because like I guess there's wild jumping spiders here, or probably some sort
Yeah.
of species. I'll see those and they're really small. I don't even know, would they be a quarter inch across at the max? So that's kind of what I thought jumping spiders maxed out at. But the actual one, like the regal jumper, seems to be like, are they an inch across or even bigger?
I don't think they're quite an inch, about, half inch,
Okay.
maybe pushing three quarters, about the size of a thumbnail. If you look at your thumbnails, that's kind of what I use as a standard gauge of when people ask what the size gets.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, they're not tiny by any means. Um, I think that's part of why they're such big TikTok stars, is because they're cute and they're big enough that you can actually get some really good footage of as an amateur with an iPhone, or just a you don't need the biggest macro camera to get good footage of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then as far as care, is it pretty standard as far as similar to the tarantulas, or is there quite a difference?
No, it's pretty close. You want to make sure you've got a well ventilated enclosure. And again, there's two camps. There's the natural camp and the dollhouse camp. Um, I'd say a lot more females collect jumping spiders than males. And the cute enclosures tend to go with that.
Hmm.
I don't know if there's a right or wrong. I don't really think so. I've seen lots of successful keepers with no substrate at all. Maybe some astroturf for a substrate, or just plain bottom, and some dollhouse furniture, or whatever your preference is. Uh, I've seen toy cars, I've seen action figures, whatever your preference is. I don't really think there's a huge difference. The only thing I would say is, if you've got some substrate, it tends to be a little easier to maintain humidity.
Mm.
So if there is an advantage to keep things in a more naturalistic environment, I'd say that's probably the biggest one. Whether a spider knows it's in a natural environment or not, I really couldn't tell you. But to me, that's the biggest advantage. So um, yeah, it's interesting to see the different way people set them up. That's for sure.
Yeah, we definitely see that same sort of thing on the reptile side as well. You get a little bit of everything, and I always say is, if there's things in the enclosure that the animal can use, then that's good. If it's a,
Absolutely.
unusable couch, then maybe it's not the best, but for the most part is, enrichment is enrichment, and you can kind
Well,
of be
there's
transferred.
two things. There's stuff that benefit the spider, and then there's stuff that benefits us, right?
Yeah.
And you want a balance of both. You want it to be enjoyable to look at and entertaining, but at the same time, you don't want to sacrifice the needs of the spider, for sure. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I don't know. I haven't really seen, jumping spiders are fairly new to me too.
Hmm.
So I haven't seen enough to really know what the best route is. But as I can tell right now, there probably isn't a whole lot of difference other than humidity and stuff like that.
Right. And something that you had just mentioned too, with women maybe being more gravitated towards jumping spiders. Something that I was really shocked by just jumping into the tarantula world is it seemed very female dominant as well. Like there's lots of women
Absolutely.
in the tarantula hobby. I feel like more women are in the tarantula hobby than there are keeping reptiles, and there's more and more women keeping reptiles, which is awesome. But I was really shocked. Like if you had to guess between the two, if you had no prior knowledge, you would assume maybe that women would more gravitate towards reptiles than spiders, but it seems totally opposite. I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, numbers don't lie. I can see all the analytics from my sites, and yeah, I would venture to say it's probably 60-40
Hmm.
for females to males in the hobby, which I might be old school thinking, but it came a bit of a surprise to me as well. I don't know why, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of females in the hobby, which is great. I mean, as long as everybody's doing the research and keeping things properly, it doesn't matter who's in it. But yeah, it's nice to see a fairly equal mix, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. And then, so besides the spiders, do you have reptiles as well, or are you just solely focused on tarantulas now?
No, I'm
Well, I guess you had the crested geckos you had mentioned.
yeah, I've got crested gecko, gargoyle geckos, bearded dragon, which is kind of my first love in reptiles. I've always had a bearded dragon. They're absolutely fascinating for me. That's my puppy. I've got lots of different invertebrates, centipedes, scorpions, whip scorpions. Basically, when it comes to invertebrates, anything I can showcase in the enclosures, and I find interesting and new, that's kind of gets added to the collection. And recently I got into snakes. My wife was deathly terrified of snakes for a long time, but she ended up holding a boa at the reptile expo in Calgary, and I was able to persuade her into letting me get a ball python. So now I've got two beautiful ball pythons, which I absolutely adore. Like they're the sweetest pet. Next to the bearded dragon, they're right up there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's so funny the
Yeah,
way people's innate fears, because it just, to me, who's someone who would be more afraid of spiders than snakes, it's funny that somebody could live with 50 spiders, but then say like, no, no, not I can't do the snake. And to me, it's just so opposite. But some people are really, really afraid of
it's
snakes, and they can tolerate the spiders.
again, I think it's two camps. Like, from talking to people, especially at expos, um, it's people who love snakes tend to be, and I mean, I could be wrong, but from my experience, people who love snakes tend to be scared of spiders, and vice versa. It's kind of two camps, but I think a lot of it has to do with the experience and knowledge throughout the years too. If you had a bad experience as a kid with a spider, then you might be afraid of spiders. If you had a bad experience with a garter snake when you were a kid, then that might be your phobia. But for me personally, I was very uneducated when it came to snakes. My only experience with snakes was as a kid with garter snakes, and the musking turned me off. So
Mm.
I thought all snakes musked. So as soon as I found out that ball pythons didn't, I was like, okay, let's check this out. And then I mean, they're just such a docile species. They're absolutely awesome. I love them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, somehow lizards get off easy. No one's like deathly afraid of lizards. Like either no legs or 8 legs. If you got 4 legs, no one cares.
Yeah,
We're all okay with
yeah,
you. It's funny.
yeah, absolutely.
And you also have a YouTube channel, and I know you're busy. You have your own business, selling tarantula enclosures, plus your own business, like you said, with plumbing. So you probably don't have a ton of time. But is the plan to focus on the YouTube channel a little bit over the year to continue to put
Yeah, I
content
think
there?
it's been a super busy summer for me. Like I say, my son moved out, and then we sold our house and downgraded a little bit. So I actually posted a video the other day, just a quick rehouse video, just to kind of get back on into the swing of things. Over the winter, I'll probably do a lot more posting. I like to just um, for me, just showing how to properly, in my opinion, properly set up an enclosure and make, your invertebrate as comfortable as possible is a bonus. There's lots of content out there. Um, but I feel if I got any kind of voice at all, I can share my experience and kind of guide people towards proper setup for a tarantula for sure. So over the winter, I hope to do a lot more content. Um, it's the reception's been good, and I enjoy doing it. It's fun. I like interacting with people. The interaction's good. So yeah, I definitely plan to do more YouTube content, but it's tough to find the time to balance everything for sure.
Oh yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I think, yeah, it's probably the last on the list as far as things that priority. But I think there's something really great as a consumer to be able to go to a YouTube channel and not only see the products being used, but the owner of the business who designed them, using them, and showing people how to walk through setups and do rehousings with them. I think it to me it was valuable because you get to see the enclosure right there on the screen that you have behind you, and yeah, I think it's a really effective way to just connect with clients. So I think that would be
Well,
awesome.
and that's what it is too. It's connection, right? I find people like to put a face and have a story behind a product. And I am active in the community. I'm accessible. You want to, let's take like any, I'm not pointing them out specific, anything like an Exoterra or a Zoom Med enclosure. You're not going to talk to the guy or have interactions with the company that makes that enclosure. It's
Hmm.
it's out there. It's a product. You take it, you leave it, whatever. So to have that the means to have that connection with the consumer base to me is invaluable. Just to share experience and like I say, the passion's there. It's all about the passion. I'm not in this for the money by any means. I've got a successful plumbing business that I deal with daily. It's the passion and just for me, the joy of having people use my enclosures and see how people set them up, it's awesome to me. So the connection and the exchange of ideas and information is key for me.
Yeah, and you took the words out of my mouth. There's something so beautiful about a small business because it's way more nimble than a larger corporation where you can take feedback and immediately implement it and probably have a product on the shelf or a product to sell, let's say in 5 months or whatever the timeline might be. But compared to a large company, could be like 2 years down the road by the time they go through all the R&D and find a supplier and all these things. So if you have a list of customers that say, hey, we really think this would be valuable, you can quickly implement that.
It's been super valuable to me. Like even from that first 3x3x6 enclosure to where it is now, the whole line is constantly evolving. The 3-inch cube, it's the new version that's coming out here. I'll be showcasing it at the CRBE. Went from just a basic 3-inch cube with a few holes in the top. Now the new one coming out, the revised version after feedback from people, it has much smaller event holes for the jumping spider community, and they're now interlocking stackable. Because
That's
people who
cool.
have and keep slings, they tend to keep lots. And like I say, I downsized my place a little bit, and I was like, okay, what are we going to do to kind of showcase these? And so now they're the new version coming out. They interlock and they stack. So that's all. I would never have thought of that if it didn't come from another breeder in Canada. Was their idea, and that's the other nice thing of having that connection with the community is the lineup is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
One of the enclosures I'm working on right now is a breeder specific enclosure for jumping spiders. So, and all that comes with feedback from the community. So it's been invaluable when it comes to design.
Yeah, I love that. That's really awesome. Well, Jeremy, this was a fascinating conversation. I have to thank you for sending me the 2 enclosures and helping me get set up properly for my first 2
Absolutely.
spiders because, like I said, there's always some fear, and it's been going well. One went through molt. I thought it was dying because it stopped eating. I'm like, oh, I guess he's just dying now. I'm not good at this. And then he was on his back, and so I had a first successful molt in one of your enclosures,
Awesome.
so that was really cool. And it's a fascinating hobby. I think we need things like this in Canada. As I said through the beginning, I think quite often Americans don't realize how limited we are here, even though we're right across the border. It's quite close. We can both be in the States in just a couple of hours. It is still disconnected as far as these types of things. There's just not a big enough population to support some of these things. So to see somebody spearhead a project like this is incredible, and I think it's going to just continue to grow. Can you let everybody know where they can find everything to do with the business, yourself, the YouTube channel?
Yeah, absolutely. On Instagram, you can find us primalfeartarantulas.ca. YouTube, same thing, Primal Fear Tarantulas. You can go to the website. It's either primalfeartarantulas.com or primalfeartarantulas.ca. Both lead to the same site, but just to cover our bases for people looking in Canada and people looking in the States. Most, so, like I say, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. And there's lots of user content tagged out there as well, where other people have set up enclosures and they're sharing their setups. So there's lots of access for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody who's going to be in Toronto for the CRBE, they'll have to come drop by your table and say hi.
Yeah, I'm absolutely come say hi. I'm super excited about that show. Just to kind of meet, like I say, I've done the Calgary show a few times now, to kind of introduce myself and get in the Eastern market and connect with those hobbyists is going to be fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, until then, Jeremy, thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll see you in September.
Awesome. Thanks, Dylan.
And that brings us to the end of another episode. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It was awesome meeting you back in June at the Winnipeg Reptile Expo. And again, I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in September at the Canadian Reptile Breeder Expo. Now, for those of you who are listening, who are also going to the expo in Toronto in September, make sure you go say hi to Jeremy. I'm sure there's several of you listening right now. It would be awesome if we could send some of the Animals at Home listening crew over to just say hi, because I think that's just what makes this podcast special is we're really starting to accumulate like-minded folks, whether that's people who are on the show as guests or people who are listening to the show as consumers. We all kind of have that same mindset, and I love the fact that we can connect with each other. So if you do see Jeremy's table and you're at that vendor, make sure you go say hi, let him know you heard him on the podcast, and go ask him questions and take a look at his product in person because it is quite beautiful. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it on social media, Facebook or Instagram. If you're looking for more information on the podcast in general, you can head to www.animalsathomenetwork.com. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome, or simply go check out the sponsor, Custom Reptile Habitats. You can find affiliate links in the show notes or the YouTube description. If you use that link and go to their website and make a purchase, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And of course, that's one way I pay the bills in this room, which continues to allow me to produce the show that everyone hopefully is enjoying. I will see you guys in the next episode.